Many had the privilege of meeting John Niparko. All have benefited from the commitment and expertise that John brought to our field. The John Niparko Memorial Lectureship has been established by the ACIA to honor his contributions and leadership in perpetuity. To launch this special lectureship and share with you on a more personal level John Niparko, we've gathered 4 speakers who have unique insights into the physician and father. So we'll have those 4 come up and speak.
Well, good morning. I'm Howard Francis, and it's great to be here with you on this most important occasion, our first lectureship in John's name. And I'm sharing some pictures that were collected by my team at my previous place of employment at Johns Hopkins Listing Center. They will be looping, so you'll see a little bit about our life with John in Baltimore. But I am forever grateful to John Niparko for his instruction, mentorship, leadership, and friendship over our 25-year association, which started when he interviewed me for residency at the University of Michigan. And although at that time we had no reason to know that our careers would overlap for so many years at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, there was born in that meeting a mutual respect that has endured through thick and thin. John was driven by an intense sense of mission to advance the practice and outcomes of multidisciplinary interventions for hearing loss and their accessibility to those who need it. John was particularly passionate about giving deaf and hard of hearing children access to broader life opportunities, including educational achievement through the development of spoken language. The Johns Hopkins Listing Center is his enduring legacy. It was, at its inception, and still is today, a national model of comprehensive and multidisciplinary cochlear implant care, extending from diagnosis to intervention to the optimization of listening and learning in the classroom. But John thought in global terms, and his advocacy for deaf and hard of hearing individuals took him to many places, from remote clinics and temporal bone laboratories to seats of national power. He had a special ability to meaningfully engage with people. He possessed a natural and irresistible charisma. John's unique skills of communicating a vision and instilling a sense of being valued as a contributor enticed many of us to partner and journey with him as trainees and colleagues in several innovative and influential initiatives, including the Listening Center, Johns Hopkins, the Childhood Development After Cochlear Implantation Study, and the establishment of the American Cochlear Implant Alliance, only to name a few. Like the bonsai master that he aspired to become, John was an effective change agent who wielded his charisma, intellect, and example to shape many of us individually and the field as a whole. As patients, families, audiologists, speech and language pathologists, teachers of the deaf, and physicians, we traveled with John to high places and experienced intense moments of professional and personal fulfillment. This happened because he inspired, he cajoled, he pushed, and sometimes shoved us to reach beyond our comfort zones and beyond what we believed we could do. As residents and fellows, the work week with John was usually a blur of long days, marathon clinics, and some tense moments in the operating room. I looked forward to those more cerebral encounters, frequently on the weekends in his office, where we would be working on projects. There was a compelling sense of doing work of great value for the field and others. I know that I'm not unique in this experience. He asked much of us. his trainees and colleagues, but he asked so much more of himself. And he was always there to support us during our own professional and personal travails. You see, his work wasn't about him. It was about developing systems that could channel the creativity and best intentions of stakeholders to fulfill the collective mission. The wide arc of John's scholarly contributions resulted from his ability to develop and sustain productive research collaborations and mentorships, relationships with colleagues and trainees, his academic family. His influence was made all the more transformative by his willingness to learn from others and continuously evolve into an increasingly patient and deliberative leader. And the establishment of the ACIA is one of his most important legacies. The John Niparko Lectureship will remind us of his commitment to an organization that places patients and families first, guided by evidence, strong ethics, and collegiality, and a dogged commitment to advocacy. It should also remind us of our responsibility to prepare and encourage a new generation of leaders. May memories of his commitment and loyalty always warm our hearts and sustain our drive and engagement in the mission for which he lived. Thank you.
I'm Margaret Winter. I am an audiologist at the University of Southern California's Caruso Family Center for Childhood Communication. I've been there for 3.5 years. Our program at USC exists because of, and only because of, John Niparko. I don't have any doubt that he cared deeply for the welfare of all of his patients, but as Howard just mentioned, undoubtedly children held a very special place in his heart. Those of you who work in very large institutions may be familiar with what I call the phyllo dough effect. Layer upon layer upon layer of having to get permissions before you could accomplish the simplest of tasks. So imagine now, my program was in existence at another facility. We had 7 audiologists, 2 speech-language pathologists, and an education specialist. And when that program became financially imperiled, and ultimately, rather abruptly, came to its end, John Niparko brought us to USC. He established us in temporary office quarters with 1 sound booth, a bunch of little rooms. We began to see patients immediately. Within a month, we had permanent office space. Within 4 months, we had a fully remodeled clinic with 4 sound booths. This happened in the space of 3 weeks. So I have no doubt that there were plans underway before those 3-week rush of activity, but it is a testament to his extraordinary powers of persuasion that he managed to do this not in years, but in weeks. I asked him when we first began to talk about this what he would do if we didn't accept his proposal to move to USC. I said, "Would you start a pediatric program anyway?" And he said, "Absolutely," in a way that left no doubt. I was familiar with John Niparko long before I met him, of course, because of his prominence in the field, and also because we participated in his CDACI study. The first time I did meet him was at an interdisciplinary meeting of professionals in Los Angeles, where we got together to talk about ways that we could improve service for children who are deaf and hard of hearing. I've worked with many fine physicians and surgeons in my career whom I appreciate and value greatly, admire greatly, but I've never met another one who knew within a year of being in Los Angeles where all the programs were, who the providers were, what services were offered, and what the funding sources were for children who are deaf and hard of hearing. He was not just a great surgeon. He saw his role as much more than that. He passed the torch from surgery to the providers in the community, a true community partner with those who provided services to children to help them learn to listen, to communicate, and to thrive, or as he very often said, to hang with their hearing peers. I speak for all the clinicians at the Caruso Family Center at USC when I say that we are pleased and proud to have known John Niparko, to be members of his team, and to be swept along in his unique tide of enthusiasm for helping children who are deaf and hard of hearing. We are immensely grateful for his time on earth, and we are privileged to do all we can to continue his vision. Thank you.
I'm Donna Sorkin. Most of you in this room knew John Niparko in his work as a surgeon and a scientist and an educator, and I'm going to speak about him from a different light. That is his work in empowering patients and trying to push out the concept of cochlear implants to the larger world. I met John for the first time in 1992. And I came into his clinic to be evaluated for a cochlear implant. He was 37 at the time, but he always looked much younger. And I wondered if he was experienced enough to do this important surgery for me. But it didn't take long to realize the qualities that he had that went beyond being an extraordinary surgeon and really looked to being involved with patients in a different way and looking to the larger world. As fate would have it, I was, at the time, moving into a new job as the executive director of the National Organization for Adults with Hearing Loss. And the next year's conference was to be held in Baltimore. And John realized what an opportunity that presented to be able to bring scientists in from Johns Hopkins and elsewhere in the country and provide a research symposium of a type that consumers typically don't have access to. And it was an experiment, and at the time my own staff didn't know if people would come. And people came, they stayed the entire time, they didn't get up from their seats. And I think he realized how empowering it would be for consumers to have that opportunity to understand the science behind their hearing. And it was an extraordinary experience. When I gave remarks recently at Johns Hopkins about the research symposium, one of the scientists who presented came up to me and said it was empowering not just for consumers, but also for us who don't have the opportunity to interact with the individuals who benefit from our science. He then became a member of the board of directors of that organization, and he served from 96 to 99. He was never anything but a regular board member. He never put himself on a pedestal. He came to all the meetings. He participated. He brought in a perspective that that board had never had before. And as others have said, he left his own unique mark on the organization in terms of empowering people to take control of their hearing loss and not depend upon professionals to tell them what they needed to do. I think one of the very unique things about John as a physician was that he went on the journey with you, and he was involved in your life. He got to know the families of his patients very intimately. This picture is of Jacob Landry, who was a young patient of John's, and he had done a cross-country bike tour to increase awareness about cochlear implants He started out in Baltimore and ended up in Los Angeles, and John rode part of the way with him in California. And this was not an atypical thing for him to do. He really did truly go on the journey with you. Another one of John's patients was U.S. Congressman David Mckinley. He's a congressman from West Virginia. He's the only congressman with a cochlear implant. And he adored John. And in July of 2015, we went to visit with him on a Friday afternoon, which is not a busy time in Washington in Congress. I'm not sure why Mr. McKinley was even in his office, but we spent an hour and a half with him talking about the challenges that we have with cochlear implants, with awareness, with reimbursement, with all of the various issues that can affect individuals' ability to access this miraculous intervention. The congressman was very excited about being involved and adding his voice. So I want to end with a quick story that I think very few people have heard before. It involves several seemingly unrelated people. The musician James Taylor, President Bill Clinton, internet guru Vincent Cerf, who will be with us on Saturday afternoon, and Saturday morning, Vince's wife, Sigrid Cerf, who has a cochlear implant. John had tickets to attend a concert of James Taylor, and he took Sigrid with him on that evening, along with, I guess, others. And the story, as he related to me, was that they also had the ability to go backstage and meet James. And so he introduced Sigrid, who wore her sound processor inside of her shirt. And as he described how wonderful this device was and the fact that it allowed Sigrid to hear the song Fire and Rain for the very first time, he also wanted to show James Taylor the processor. So Sigrid pulled the processor out of her shirt and shared it, and it clearly made an impression on James Taylor. So several weeks later, the Cerfs were going to the White House, and they asked John to go along and join them on the visit. And he met President Clinton, and of course didn't miss the opportunity to talk to the president about cochlear implants. Went through the whole story again and mentioned that they had met James Taylor and shared the fact that Sigrid had heard the song Fire and Rain for the first time in her life. And the president responded, "Yes, I know. My good friend James told me about it." So I think we'll end there, and we have one more wonderful speaker for today.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Kevin Niparko. Dr. Niparko was my father. While the musicians were playing earlier, I saw someone in the back taking a photo on their phone with the front-facing camera. They're sort of holding it out in front of them. And it reminded me of my dad's own inability to figure out the iPhone's rotating camera. For being such a bright guy and a champion of technology, this was a little too much for him. And when the selfie became popular, unfortunately, he'd hold out his phone in front of him, but then he'd have to rotate it around, which led to some misses. Well, I'm glad to see that my dad's legacy is alive and well in the room today. Thank you for inviting us and my family to join you here today. It's a great honor and privilege to hear the stories of my dad's impact. I know he was a strong proponent and champion of this community. He saw this community as a special opportunity to bring together the great minds in medicine, research, industry, to help push the boundaries of cochlear implant technologies. I know my father was proud of what the organization had accomplished in the last 15 years, and he understood the difficult work that lies ahead. I'd like to share some brief stories today about my dad as a father and a husband, the man outside the hospital and research lab that many of you have come to know over the years. My dad was my editor growing up. Whenever I was assigned a paper, I'd write a first draft and we'd workshop it together. They say every writer writes for someone, the person who, when you put an idea down on paper, you think about how he or she will respond, what questions they'll ask. For me, that person has and always will be my dad. The ritual was always the same. It didn't matter if it was a second grade science paper on Arctic seals or my senior thesis. It didn't matter if he'd spent all day in the operating room or it was a casual Saturday afternoon after the Michigan game. We'd sit at the kitchen table, a draft in front of each of us, and he'd quietly read through it. When he was finished, he'd flip through the pages, thinking. Then the suggestions would begin. This was always a tense moment. You'd find out if the paper was nearly finished or if the work had only just begun. For those of you who collaborated with my dad on publications in the past, you may know this feeling. Avoid the passive voice here. New word, cut this paragraph. My dad was fond of clear and precise communication. He believed that language was the bedrock of human connectivity, the foundation on which relationships and trust and love and learning could grow. It was through these workshopping sessions that I learned the immense value that my dad placed on communication. But the edits also went beyond the grammar. Ever the avid researcher, he would immerse himself in the topic, excited for what the assignment was about. After reading a draft of my college thesis on U.S. cybersecurity policy, I received an unsolicited email from him a few days later. The subject was thought. Somewhere in his busy schedule at the hospital between patients and research and surgery, he'd been contemplating U.S. cybersecurity. He had an idea, and he needed to share it with me immediately. This was something that I'd come to know and love about my dad. When asked for help, he was willing to go to great lengths to give everything that he had to make the project a success. It was in part his fascination with communication that led him to otolaryngology and cochlear implantation. My dad felt a strong connection to the mission shared by everyone in the room. He saw pediatric deafness as one of the great biological challenges of our time and dedicated his career to improving access and care for children in need of a cochlear implant. His work often followed him home in various charming and sometimes hilarious ways. While he was somewhat soft-spoken by nature, my dad learned to adjust his speech patterns and volume to clearly articulate his words so his patients could better understand him. But he wasn't always able to turn it off, which made our family dinner conversations somewhat louder than the average. When high school friends or girlfriends would come visit our house, he never hesitated to whip out a larger-than-life model cochlea he kept in his study to give these unsuspecting guests a quick primer on the inner ear. And when Halloween would roll around, he'd insist on serving candy out of an all-too-lifelike human skull that he'd picked up in med school. If you trick-or-treated at the Niparko house in the 90s, you probably know what I'm talking about. These quirks came from something deep at my dad's core. What he did was more than a job. It was his life mission and his calling. He loved his work, and he couldn't help but share that passion with everyone around him. My dad was a lot of things to a lot of people. He was a husband, a surgeon, a researcher, a boss, a colleague, a bonsai enthusiast, and a father. But even within that role as a father, he was a lot of things. He was a friend, a confidant, a role model, an editor, and a coach. He lived his life attuned to a few core values: a commitment to family, relentlessness to give himself to those who needed him, a love for learning and seeing others achieve the unexpected. It is these values instilled within me and everyone who touched my father that he will continue to live on. It is his legacy and his gift. Thank you.
Thank you to Kevin and Donna, Margaret, and Howard for helping round out the many facets of John Niparko for us. Also in attendance today is his wife Angie, and I'd like to acknowledge her presence. And their other son, Nathan, is on his way back. He had hoped to be here, but he's traveling back from Europe. He'll be joining us on Saturday for the consumer event. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker and our first John Niparko Memorial Lecturer. If you don't know Bruce Gantz, you have definitely walked into the wrong meeting. Dr. Gantz is the head of the department. You're welcome to stay. You will learn some interesting things. And Dr. Gantz is head of the Department of Otolaryngology, Head and Neck Surgery, and he's the Brian F. McCabe Distinguished Chair at the University of Iowa. He's a professor of otolaryngology. He's also a professor of neurosurgery. Dr. Gantz travels the world presenting at conferences, but has always had his home base in Iowa. He completed undergraduate work in medical school at the University of Iowa. He briefly ventured out of state to do his internship in Utah, the University of Utah. Quickly returned to Iowa for residency. Then he got really brave. Not only did he leave Iowa, he left the country. Did some fellowship work with Ugo Fish in Zurich. He then returned permanently to the safety of Iowa. His first of many publications was an otology topic, localization of collagenase in chronically inflamed guinea pig temporal bones. Curiously, briefly went off the rails and next authored How I Do It, Plastic Surgery. Practical suggestions on facial plastic surgery to trapezius myocutaneous eyelid flap. Not long after that, he made it back on the straight and narrow with preliminary assessment of the Los Angeles, Vienna, and Melbourne cochlear implants. Since then, he's not looked back. Bruce has helped shape our industry, and in particular, push forward the hybrid concept. I live near Bruce, one state north. We've shared many patients. We've spent time together around the world at meetings. We've had, I wrote initially, the occasional glass of fine wine, and maybe more than the occasional glass of fine wine. We shared a lot of good skiing days together. I was fortunate to have known Mary. Through these experiences, I've come to appreciate the breadth and depth of his skill as a clinician, a surgeon, a researcher, a mentor, a friend, and most importantly, a family man. It's with great pleasure that I welcome Dr. Gantz to the podium as our first John Niparko Memorial Lecturer.
Well, good morning, Angie and Kevin, colleagues. I am deeply honored to be selected as the first John Niparko lecturer, and I have a couple of stories to tell about John. I first met him when he was a fellow with John Kimmick, a good friend of mine at the University of Michigan, and that was probably more than 25 years ago. John was someone that was interested in the facial nerve, and I had an interest in the facial nerve, and that's how we got together and shared some research and some patients. And he worked with John for many years until John was tragically taken away from us. So, I think that John has led many efforts. His language, clinical trials, and multi-center trial investigations is phenomenal. But one of the more important things he did early on was really set the stage for cost effectiveness for cochlear implants, and actually did some really good work for adults and children. John was a colleague of ours on our long-lasting cochlear implant clinical research center grant. He was an external advisor, and he actually, what Kevin said about reading and making suggestions was real. John helped us immensely throughout the years, and last April, we had an external review meeting as we were trying to get another grant. And John was going to come to Iowa City. He called me. He said, "No, I can't make it. I'm just not doing as well." John was on the phone with us for about an hour and made our grant much better. Unbeknownst to us, we didn't know how seriously ill he was at that time, and he died just a few weeks later. But John's legacy will live on forever, and this lectureship should do that. So I'm going to ask a question and try to answer it for you. When should we attempt to preserve residual acoustic hearing in children? This work is supported by grants from the NIDCD and from the Iowa Lions and Hearing Foundation. And my colleagues that have helped me put this together are Marlon Hansen and Camille Dunn from our Cochlear Implant Clinical Research Center that we have at Iowa. And I also want to let you know that a disclosure that I am a consultant for Cochlear Corporation. Okay, so advancing, must be there. Okay, so the outline here is to talk about why residual hearing is important and what parameters are we looking at. What are our long-term results in adults? We've got 16 years of experience with this procedure in adults, and then some preliminary work with children. So what are the advantages when you put acoustic and electric together in the same ear? If we look at the three frequencies and the low frequencies, we know that if you preserve 125, 250, and 500 at a functional level, and we'll talk about that in a minute, you can increase word understanding about 20% over just electric only. More importantly, you can hear in noise, a significant improvement in signal-to-noise level, which you can't do with hearing aids. And if you preserve low frequency in both ears, you have spatial hearing, which is really important to children in a noisy environment and to adults. And if you have low frequency hearing, you might be able to appreciate that beautiful aria that we just heard this morning. You can't do that very well with the signal processing in cochlear implants. And so the quality of sound, that timbre, is there with low frequency information. And why? Because it has a temporal fine structure that we have not been able to reproduce with our cochlear implant strategies in speech processing in any of the devices. This is just a collection of patients that we've had over many years. Let's see, how do I get that pointer to work? Oh, there it is. Okay. This line here is orange is a group of cochlear implants and postlingually deafened adults. The average is between 50 and 60% word understanding with one device. If you put two devices in, you get about a 10% growth in word understanding. However, if you preserve that low frequency hearing, you get about a 20% enhancement in that patient population. Now, when I'm talking about functional acoustic hearing, let's just review this just for a minute. And this is from work from Hornsby and Ricketts. They classified functional acoustic hearing as amplifiable acoustic hearing, And you had to have better than 90 dB in the low frequencies. And in the highs, and some of this work is from Chris Turner, that you had to have better than 65 dB in order for acoustic hearing to be amplified. And more importantly, these three frequencies, 125, 250, and 500, are the most important for that fine structure. So to illustrate that this is a group of patients that are electric plus acoustic for in only the implant ear, and it's called the hybrid condition. And this is a group of L24 patients, and it didn't make any difference if that pure tone average of those lows was moderate, moderate severe, or severe, up to 70 to 75 dB pure tone average. They still got a bump of about 40% improvement in their word understanding over electric only. And if you have a group of shorter electrode patients, you got the same thing from mild to severe, an improvement from pre-op to post-op. But if you didn't have that acoustic hearing, you didn't get that bump. Speech understanding and noise. On this task, this is a Chris Turner slide, that if you played sentence material and adaptively increased the noise, you could have a signal-to-noise ratio of -23 dB for average hearing people on this task. Standard cochlear implant patients take 10 dB above the noise threshold to understand 50% of the words. Our hybrid patients were around 9 to 10 dB. That's a significant improvement in word understanding, about 40 to 70% according to Eddington. And if you had a better or you had a better preservation of that acoustic hearing, you did better with that your signal-to-noise ratio was better than if you had a poorer average. Now, we also know that we thought that the inner ear was hardwired, that the place pitch of this Greenberg map was pretty accurate and it was something we were born with. Well, however, if you put a short electrode in a patient, over time, that pitch matching on that ear is altered over a period of years, this is 50 months, that some of these patients learn that this electrode at 750 hertz actually sounds like 750 hertz. And we had a patient which had a long electrode and a short electrode, and this is where this patient pitch matched the lows, mediums, and highs, and on the short side, it was quite different. Here was the lows, mediums, and highs. This patient had 100% CNC word understanding, one of the only patients that we've had like that. And two different electrodes pitch matching differently in different ears. This is an important graph, and I think it's something that some of us or some of you in the audience may not appreciate. This is 3 different lengths of electrodes. These are 10 millimeter electrodes in red. This is yellow is 16 millimeter electrodes. This is 24 or standard electrodes. Each bar represents one person. And you can see the variability in performance in all 3 electrodes independent of the length. And so the human ear can adapt. This is electric only. This is not electric plus acoustic. So there is an ability for some patients to do better than others. Now, why is that? Well, one of the things that we've just recently published, and Elliot Shearer, one of our residents that's a PhD in genetics with Richard Smith, we have over 400 blood samples of our cochlear implant patients, and we were trying to figure out if there was some genetic correlations. And what we found that if you had a genetic defect, and we know that there are 85 genes associated with the sensory partition in the organ of Corti, that those patients did really well. But if you had a genetic defect in the neural partition, you did pretty poorly. And so this is something that we may be able to help us differentiate why different patients do differently. So let's talk a little bit about some of these results in these hybrid patients over a number of years. There's 164 patients in different clinical trials between 2000 and 2014. There were 10 millimeter devices, 16 this is another 10 millimeter device and a 16 millimeter device. And that's where they went in. The difference between the S8 and the S12, the S8 had 6 channels, the S12 had 10. This one had 22 channels. And then we also will show some work from the 20 and 24 millimeter implants that Colin and I actually shared some data. But if you look at the 10 millimeter devices, this is their preoperative hearing, and this is their postoperative hearing. The red is the S8 trial, the yellow is the S12 trial, and the blue is the L24 trial. And this is 12-month data. And you can see that, well, these red guys didn't do quite as good, but one of the things we learned here is that we didn't pay attention in this first group of patients as to the duration of deafness in that high frequency or the age. And the older the patient, they didn't do as well with a shorter device. And this is just a comparison of the combined, which means the 2 hearing aids plus the implant in these groups compared to our bilateral groups and a group of unilaterals that were done about the same time. These patients weren't doing as well with unilateral because these were older patients. They don't do as well as some of the younger patients. So how do we do with preserving hearing when you put an electrode in the ear 20 millimeters or 10 millimeters? This is a group of 262 patients that have either a 10 millimeter device, a 16 millimeter device, 20 or 24. IA is initial activation. That's when the first month. And then in the clinical trial, at 1 year, we had 9% had lost their functional hearing. If we follow those patients for 9 years, 17% lose their functional hearing, 83% are still good. With the S8, we did a little bit better. Over time, at 4 years, we're at about 8%. The L24 in the clinical trial was 25% loss of hearing, 75% preservation. When we did it at Iowa, it was 85. If you put the electrodes in longer, 20 millimeters to 24 millimeters, we don't do as well at all. So this is our group of patients at Iowa. We had 82 that have had functional hearing, or 89%. The red are the ones that have lost hearing over time. Now, why do we lose hearing? This is some work that we sent a temporal bone to Joe Nadal, and his group worked up this patient. They died 7 years after having lost their hearing in 4 months after the cochlear implant. And what we found is, this is where the cochlear implant was in 10 millimeters, that in that basal turn, there was fibrosis. There were some high drops. But in the upper turns, there was normal-looking hair cells and ganglion cells. So we didn't destroy that. And so what we were probably doing here is we have caused an inner ear conductive block. And so we need to figure out how to reduce that so that we can get 95 to 98% preservation of hearing. One of the things that we do, we put this device through the round window now. We try to secure the electrode to the tegmen with a suture to hold it in place, and so that we can take our fingers off of it and not have the memory of the implant moving around. And we take 2 to 4 minutes to put it in. That's really slow. I'll tell you, you sit there and have somebody counting off, you're wondering why you're still sitting there. So what are those long-term results? We just published this. It's now under EPUB with laryngoscope. And so I'll share with you those results. First, this is a paper that one of Chris Turner's graduate students and we did together a while ago, looking at hearing and change in hearing over a 10-year period. It's about 1 dB per year that you lose hearing. This is adults, this is children. Importantly, children maintain their low frequencies even though they are losing their highs. Not all, but that's really important. So here's 108 patients. We had 23 with the S8 that have 15 years of experience, S12, 7 years of experience, the L24, 7 years, and the 422 or 522, which are the 20 to 24 millimeter devices, 2 years up to 4 years, or 3 years. So you're going to see lines, and these are individual patients. Time is in the horizontal, pure tone average, 90 dB, functional versus non-functional hearing. Some of these patients lose it early on, a couple later, but here we have patients out here 15 years, really haven't changed much. They change initially. You lose about 15 dB when you put the device in. Here's 83% preservation at 9 years. Here's the the S12. We did a little bit better there. At 4 years, we lost 1. Some of these patients have some problems, then come back and continue to do very well. 92% are still using hearing aids. L24, our series, you see we have 1 patient here at a year. Most of the patients lost it early on. Most of them are really keeping good hearing, 85%. Unfortunately, this is our group of the longer electrodes, and we've done things, but we just can't seem to preserve it out here to 24 months. Only 45% have some residual hearing. And that's the graphs of these patients. And if you look at the probability of maintaining that hearing, we found that if you have really good hearing to start with at 6 months, you've got an 88% probability of keeping that at 10 years. If you're with the L, it's a little better. If you're at 80, you're not going to do as well over 10 years. You may lose it. Here are some of the results over time. At 9 years, 75% correct with the S8, 87% correct on the CNC word score in the combined condition with the 2 hearing aids and the implant, and 83% average score CNC for the L24. In noise, we started out around 40 dB pure tone, a probability at percent correct was about 40% correct, and with their hearing aids, with the S12 and the L24, about 28. At 4 years, at a signal-to-noise ratio of 5 dB, about 70% word understanding. Huge improvement. And this is the probability of maintaining that for a long period of time. So what about children now? We've approached children rather slowly here, and the first group of children that we did were adolescents. And you know this is a difficult group to do. And but we took some 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds that were not doing well with their hearing aids, and we decided to use the L24 device. Recently, we've done some younger children. We don't have a lot of kids here, but I think you see the trend. We have 8 children. These children here were the adolescents, 11 to 15 years of age. This patient has bilateral hybrids. Was at 6 and 6.5 years that we implanted. This one was implanted at 5 years, and this one implanted at 6.5 years. This is their preoperative threshold versus their postoperative threshold. If there's no change, it would be on this horizontal line here. We did have a little change in that. Now, this is their most recent. We're still within the functional level with all of these kids. Here they are at up to 5 years, 60 months. This is their pure tone average over time. This red child here actually was mowing the lawn, noticed his hearing went down. We gave him some steroids. I don't know if that had any effect on it, but we brought him back. Here he is. His performance is at 92% word understanding, where he was preoperatively down here. But all of these kids are able to still use their acoustic component up to 5 years. This child was a difficult child. It was a broken marriage, and the wife did not want the implant. The husband did, and unfortunately we went ahead and did it. The child went to the school for the deaf, doesn't really use the device, and has really stopped using the device. So that's going to be an issue that you have to really be careful of. Hopefully, maybe if the child grows up and still has the device in place, they could get something out of it. After a little bit of time, we can actually do some spatial testing on these kids, and their pre-operative versus their post-operative RMS squared error. And you can see that some of the kids aren't doing quite as well as they did pre-operatively. This is the child that doesn't use the implant. She's doing a little better. But if you compare that to a similar group of children that have acoustic hearing and are bimodal, they have a difficult time with spatial hearing. And that 40% is chance. And so these kids are not normal. Adults are around 20 degrees RMS average with 2 cochlear implants. Not normal, but it's an improvement. Here's how they did pre-op versus post-op, most recent, and this is the time that we've been following these kids. This is the child that's not using it. These are younger kids, and we're actually looking at PBK words here and not CNCs. These are CNCs. If you take that one child out that doesn't use it, we're at around 77% correct for that group. And this is the results with the, on the PBK words. If you look at our group of kids that are bimodal, using a standard electrode on one ear and a hearing aid in the other in green versus the 4 kids that are using it, we're about the same. The advantage here is that you're still preserving that low frequency hearing. You're helping them with spatial hearing, and you're probably helping them with music that Kate Gefeller will talk about soon. So in conclusion, I think that preserving residual hearing at a functional level does many things for these kids and for the adults. I think that low frequency hearing is more stable than we once thought, and we have a lot of children that have hearing, acoustic hearing in those low frequencies that are getting standard cochlear implants that we're losing it. And I think we need to rethink that, because I think it's really important for them as they move forward and as we move forward. Functional hearing can be preserved in our adults up to 16 years now, and up to 5 years in children. We've got to figure out how we reduce the trauma as we put these devices in, what kinds of factors that we can do to reduce inflammation, to prevent at least one type of condition that we know causes the hearing loss, and that is that conduction block. And you have to realize that if you're going to do an adolescence, as you all know in this room, that it can be difficult. And we should probably be implanting earlier than waiting until they are teenagers. And I think the answer to the question that I posed initially, I think we should always try to preserve functional hearing in these children, especially the low frequencies. I think low frequency matters. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gantz. This glass is from a glassmaker in the Vermont area, apparently near where Nate and Kevin went to school, and John was particularly fond of this glassmaker. So I'd like to present the first edition of this to Dr. Gantz. Thank you. So that wraps up our opening ceremonies. I'd like to just thank the Niparko family again for participating in this event, and I encourage you all to spend some time with our exhibitors who support this and each other and learn from each other, and let's push things forward. So thank you very much.